Hi and welcome to Military Diorama. Thank you for subscribing if you already have, and if you haven't, please consider doing so. Today's video is part 3 of the Academy Tiger build. I'm going to be doing winter camouflage, but I'm going to be doing it a little differently to the normal way of doing it. After the paint modulation, I have done some streaking and some chipping on the tank, and that's all in preparation for the winter camouflage. Most of it will be covered up by the winter camouflage. I'm going to be using watercolours as opposed to using the hairspray technique or chipping fluid. I'm doing this because I've got some reference photos and I want to try and do the camouflage as closely as possible to the photos. I've only ever done winter camouflage once before, which was using hairspray technique, and I just had an idea of doing it this way. I was going to use oil paints, and then I decided to use watercolours. And basically, I just got quite an expensive tube of white watercolour from an artist shop. I got an expensive one because of the high pigment count. And I started off by brush applying it, and then I also used an airbrush to do some fading on it. I thinned the paint down quite a lot, just with tap water. The products I used for this paint job were white and black watercolours, and I made a grey up to do a little bit of streaking. I had 2 pots of water. One was for cleaning the brush and one was for removing the paint, some kitchen roll, an airbrush and a couple of brushes. As I mentioned before, I've never done it this way, so it was a little bit of trial and error. I basically brush applied the paint over the entire lower hull, including over the tools, and then I started removing with a clean brush and clean water. I found it worked better if you left it to dry completely. I've used a few methods of removing it, as in using a damp brush and using a damp cotton bud or Q-tip, and I also tried flooding the panels and removing the water with a dry brush, so just sucking the water off the surface and blending it that way. I also, on the sides, I used a vertical streaking motion so I wanted to achieve a look of brush strokes, which would be how they applied it in the field. But then on the top surfaces, I did a stippling effect with the white and grey, so that it looked like rain had fallen on it, and that was on the sloped surfaces. Sorry, the flat surfaces. On the sloped surface of the turret, I again used a downward stroke, just using the grey watercolour to do some dirty areas around the hatches and stuff. Let the paint dry, wet it a little bit and removed it. Then if I wasn't happy with the way it looked, I'd either add more paint or remove more paint. Once I'd done the lower hull, I moved on to the turret and did that in the same way. It took quite a lot of trial and error with the actual removal and trying to make it look realistic. But the good thing about it is you can always add more, because you can always remove it because it's water based. And I just found it a little bit easier than the hairspray technique. Once I'd removed some of it with the water, I then went over a little bit with the airbrush and just did a little bit of fading. I found obviously the airbrush applied paint was thinner, which I found a lot easier to remove than the brush applied paint, but I was quite happy with the effect I was getting. I just carried on working through it, doing it systematically and just trying to get it to look how I wanted it to look, which was as it looked in the reference photos, which is the actual tank that I'm trying to do. So on the upper surfaces, or the flat surfaces, I tried to achieve a dirty-ish look by using a grey mix of the paints, and around the turret ring and other areas where water and dirt would collect, I put a greyish colour so it looked dirty, and I applied this in the same way that I do the top surfaces with oil paints, and just stippled it on, because it obviously wouldn't streak, because there's no vertical surfaces for it to streak on, and just worked around it. adding grey to make it look dirty. Just carried on doing this around the entire upper hull, on all the flat surfaces. On the front of the glacis plate, I did streaking with a bit of grey as well around the vision slit, where you'd get mud collecting behind there's a little protective step. Just did some grey streaking down there, and also from by the machine gun, the cartwheel gun. The turret was done in the same way as the lower hull. I avoided getting the whitewash where you couldn't get the whitewash if you were painting it in the field, so behind the turret bin I didn't worry too much. I also painted the barrel, which I didn't need to because on the reference photos there's no whitewash on the barrel, but it had been painted with whitewash, so I painted it and removed it to leave the residue. And just as I say, working on it with a paintbrush, avoiding the numbers because they weren't painted, and then just went round it afterwards with a damp brush and a Q-tip and removed the paint from where I didn't want it. And again, on the top of the turret I used the stippling motion, apart from on the part that is sloped where I brushed it on. And like the lower hull, on the top I used grey and white to make it look dirty around areas where mud would collect. It took me quite a while to do it, but then it's my first time doing it, and I think once I try it again it should be a lot quicker. The only reference photos I have of this particular tank are side-on views, so I removed quite a large amount of the whitewash from the upper turret, partly because I wanted the grey to show through and also the streaking that I'd done, but also I figured that because of all the movement around the top you'd have less whitewash, and also the rain flow or water flow, so that's what I chose to do with the top of the turret, because like I say, I had no reference photos. I just thought that that's what it would look like. I also painted the hatch, the commander's hatch, with a brush, and did it in. I had some photos of that, so I did it so it looked like that sort of thing. And I just removed the paint using a damp brush. I used on the storage bin, I flooded the top of that with water and then removed it from the centre, so you had whitewash on the edges, and then removed it from the very edge with a damp Q-tip. And it was just trial and error, really, just removing the paint in a certain way with the water until I was happy with the way that it looked. Once I'd got it to the way I liked it at the time, I went back and looked at the reference photos, which was when I noticed there was no paint on the gun barrel, and I just removed paint from where there wasn't paint. But also I've got two reference photos of the same tank, and they both got different amounts of whitewash on, because obviously it would wash off quite quickly. So I took a little bit of artistic liberty with it and just did it so I was happy with the way it looked. Again, I just avoided getting the whitewash where they wouldn't have painted on. Like around the grenade launches, I didn't put too much because I thought they wouldn't bother trying to get into the edges of that sort of thing, and just carried on until I was happy with the effect. After I'd done the lower hull and the turret, I moved on to the running gear, and I only painted the two sets of outermost wheels, as they wouldn't have removed the wheels to paint them. From the photos I have, there wasn't a lot of paint on the actual wheels, and also there wasn't a lot of paint on the side skirts, so I replicated that in the removal of the paint. Here I'm just applying a very thin coat of whitewash to the road wheels. As I mentioned, I only did the outer two sets of road wheels because they wouldn't have moved them to paint them, they wouldn't have tried to get into them. And also from the reference images, there was very little paint left. So after I'd applied it, I allowed it to go off, but I went back to the lower hull and started removing and adding paint where I wanted to achieve the effect from the photos that I wanted to achieve, and to make it look, I didn't want to replicate the photos so much, but replicate the effect on the photos. I first started removing the paint on the lower road wheels with a damp brush, and then I wasn't achieving the effect that I wanted, so I moved on to flooding the surface of the road wheel with water and then removing it using a dry brush, so just sucking the water off the surface, which gave me a bit of a better effect of what I was looking for, and also used a Q-tip to remove it. I wanted like a faded inner and outer, which is I achieved that by using a flooded surface. Like I say, it's all trial and error because I've not really done this effect before, but the end result was quite good. I also went over the rubber parts of the road wheel afterwards with a dark grey colour. I didn't use Vallejo dark rubber because it was too similar to the colour of the actual metal or the paint that I'd used on the body, so I used a slightly darker grey colour for the road wheel rubbers. I think the best method that I found for the paint removal was the flooding technique, which works on flat surfaces and also larger areas, but the only problem with that is you've got to be careful that it doesn't leave tide marks. If you don't remove all the water, then it will dry naturally and it will leave tide mark lines, which can help in some instances, but normally it's best to get all the water off. The Q-tip worked quite well as well on the edges and also for a bit of vertical streaking. The wet brush or damp brush was good. It managed to do, or you could do fading with it a little bit like oil paints, but not the same because water tends to have more capillary action, so it doesn't spread out as much as oil paint does, which is also quite helpful for localized weathering. But like I say, it's just trial and error, and I'd never done this before, and I was very happy with the end result. After I'd finished applying it, I just went over it, looking around, and then seeing where I wanted to improve the technique. Some places I wanted to show more of the base paint just because it gives a nice contrast. Doing streaking with the brushes downwards with the rain motion to remove the whitewash, and also doing the stippling on the flatter surfaces. Generally speaking, there was more paint on the lower part of the tank because obviously it gets less rain, but also so on the lower hull I removed more paint from the top of the lower hull or the top of the edges because you'd get more rubbing there and the rain would run down. And then I replicated the effect of, well, I replicated the photos, or tried to, with the side skirts, because there was very little paint on the front side skirts and it kind of wore down in a triangular manner. So the top of the front side skirt had paint on and there was like a diagonal line working downwards, so I did that on the one side. On the other I did it slightly differently just to break up the look of the kit. The road wheels, again, I removed the majority of the white paint. The rear hull, sorry, I left quite a bit on the higher up bits, but removed it from the lower bits. And the front glacis plate and the lower hull glacis plate, I left pretty much completely painted. I added some more grey streaking to it, and like I said, I just worked around the kit until I was happy with the end result. And I will do subsequent weathering to it. Again, I'm not sure what I will do, whether it will be oils or I might try with the watercolours. I'm not sure how that will work out, but it's also going to be having the next video will be mud effects, which I'll be using Vallejo earth texture. So that will be quite interesting. I've used it before on ground texture, like on dioramas, but never for mud effects on a vehicle, so that'll be quite an interesting change. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been, well, I've quite enjoyed doing it. It's a bit of a change. I'll leave you some stills of the finished tank. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more content like this, then please consider subscribing. Leave a like, leave a comment, and I hope you have a good day. See you next week.